The hall was bright with golden lights and soft music playing in the background. It was one of those expensive company events where everyone tried to look perfect, speak carefully, and hide their real emotions behind polite smiles. Crystal glasses clinked, cameras flashed, and powerful people moved around in groups, talking about business profit and future plans. She stood near the side of the hall, holding a glass of water instead of wine. She did not like drawing attention to herself. Most people at the event only knew her as the quiet daughter-in-law of a very influential family. Nothing more. She preferred it that way for now. But not everyone saw her with respect. Across the room, her mother-in-law sat with a group of senior guests, laughing loudly and enjoying the attention. She was known in the company's circles as a strong personality, someone who liked control and expected obedience from everyone around her. When her eyes landed on her daughter-in-law standing alone, her smile changed slightly. It was not warm. It was sharp, almost mocking. She excused herself from the group and walked over with slow, confident steps. Her heels clicked against the marble floor. A few nearby guests noticed but quickly looked away, sensing tension. "So you finally decided to show up?" she said in a low voice as she reached her. The daughter-in-law gave a small, polite nod. "Good evening." The reply was calm, but it did not soften the mood. The mother-in-law looked her up and down, as if judging her presence at the event. "You are standing here like a guest, not like someone who belongs here," she said quietly, but the tone carried insult more than conversation. The daughter-in-law did not respond immediately. She simply took a slow sip of water. She had learned not to react quickly to provocation. Silence, in many situations, spoke louder than words. But the silence only seemed to irritate the older woman more. Around them, the music continued, and people kept talking, but a few nearby guests started noticing the tension building. It was subtle at first, just sharp words and cold expressions. Then it became more visible. "You always act like you are better than you are," the mother-in-law continued, standing quietly, pretending to be important. "Do you even know how things work in this company?" The daughter-in-law finally looked at her. Her expression was steady. "I understand more than you think." That simple sentence felt like a challenge. The mother-in-law let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it, only pride and irritation. "Understand? You? Let's not pretend." She turned slightly, noticing a nearby table where drinks were placed. Without saying anything more, she picked up a glass of red wine. For a moment, she just held it, as if deciding something. The daughter-in-law noticed a movement, but did not step back. Her face remained calm, though her eyes became more focused. Guests nearby slowly began to sense something was about to happen. Conversation started fading. A few people turned their attention toward them. In one sudden movement, the mother-in-law stepped closer, and then she threw the wine. The red liquid splashed across the daughter-in-law's dress, staining the fabric instantly. A few drops fell onto the polished floor, and the glass of the room seemed to freeze. Conversation stopped completely. Even the background music felt distant in that moment. Gasps were heard from nearby guests. Someone covered their mouth. A few people looked away, uncomfortable, but no one stepped forward. The mother-in-law stood there, holding the empty glass, her expression firm. She looked satisfied, as if she had just proved a point. "This is what happens when you forget your place," she said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. The daughter-in-law stood still. The wine dripped slowly, but she did not move immediately. She looked down at the stain on her dress for a moment, then slowly raised her eyes. There was no anger on her face, no tears, no panic, only silence. That silence made the moment heavier than any reaction could have. She gently placed the empty glass she was holding on a nearby table. Then, without saying a single word, she took a napkin and slowly began to clean the wine from her hand. Her movements were calm, controlled, almost as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside the hall, everyone was now watching. And for the first time that evening, the attention was no longer on the mother-in-law. It was on the woman she had just publicly humiliated. She did not say a single word after that moment. Not at the party, not in front of the guests, not even when someone rushed forward with tissues and awkward apologies. She simply took a slow breath, looked at the stain spreading across her dress, and stepped back from the center of attention. The music had started again, but it felt forced, like the room was trying too hard to pretend nothing had happened. People began to whisper in small groups. Some looked shocked, some uncomfortable, and a few even looked amused, but nobody openly supported what had just taken place. Her mother-in-law stood a few steps away, still holding herself with pride. She believed she had won something important in that moment. In her mind, she had drawn a clear line and shown everyone who had authority in that space. She turned back toward her guests, adjusting her expression into a confident smile, as if the incident was already forgotten. But the woman she had humiliated did not leave the building in anger or shame. She did something that no one expected. She calmly walked toward the side exit, her step steady, her posture straight, even though her dress was stained and her presence had just been insulted in front of powerful people. Outside the hall, the air was cooler. The noise of the celebration became distant. She stopped for a moment near the entrance corridor, away from cameras and eyes. Only then did she allow herself a quiet pause. She closed her eyes for a brief second, not because she was weak, but because she was thinking. This was not the first time she had been underestimated. In fact, it was something she had grown used long before this marriage, long before this family, and long before this company ever became part of her life. She had learned early that people often confuse silence with weakness and patience with helplessness. And that mistake, more than anything else, often reveals the truth about them. She slowly reached into her small clutch bag and took out a phone. The screen lit up in her hand, showing a secure private interface that most people in the company never even knew existed. It was not a regular contact list or social account. It was a direct communication line used only by top-level decision makers in the organization. Her finger hovered for a moment. Then she made a single call. On the other side, in a different part of the city, a senior executive who had been attending another business meeting felt his phone vibrate. When he saw the signal, his expression immediately changed. He did not hesitate. He stood up from the table and stepped outside before answering. "Yes," he said carefully, his tone respectful. There was a short pause as she spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, and controlled. She did not mention the party. She did not mention the insult. She did not raise her voice or show emotion. She simply gave instructions. As he listened, his face became more serious with each passing second. He nodded even though she could not see him. "Understood," he said finally. The call ended. Inside the company world, nothing seemed to change at first. The celebration still continued, and people still laughed inside the hall, but something quiet had already begun shifting behind the scenes. Her identity was not something the public, or even most employees, understood fully. To the outside world, she was just a member of a powerful family by marriage. Someone present at events, someone noticed but not truly recognized. But within the highest levels of the organization, the reality was very different. A long time ago, before her marriage had even happened, she had quietly become involved in the company's structure through legal arrangements and strategic decisions that very few people knew about. Her role was hidden carefully, not because she lacked power, but because revealing it too early would have created internal conflict and instability within the organization. There were only a handful of people who knew the truth: senior board members, trusted legal advisors, and a few top executives. They followed her instructions without question, not out of fear, but out of recognition of her authority. And now, standing alone outside the celebration hall, she was not thinking about revenge or emotional reaction. She was thinking about control, structure, and balance. Because what had happened inside that hall was not just a personal insult. It was something that exposed deeper problems within behavior, respect, and influence in the environment she had quietly built a role in. Meanwhile, inside the hall, her mother-in-law continued to enjoy attention from guests. She was laughing again, telling small stories, and acting as if nothing had happened. To her, the wine incident was a demonstration of dominance, a message sent and received. She believed her position in the family and the company network gave her the right to act without consequence. But she did not notice the subtle changes beginning around her. A few senior employees who had been observing the situation were now exchanging quiet looks. One of them checked their phone and saw a message that made their expression change slightly. Another received a call and stepped away from the group without explanation. At first, it seemed normal, just business interruptions. Nothing unusual. But within a short time, the tone inside the organization began to shift in ways that were not immediately visible to everyone. Certain approvals that were usually automatic were suddenly delayed. A few decisions that had been expected to go through without issue were now marked for review. Small administrative changes began appearing in internal systems, subtle enough that only those paying close attention would notice. The mother-in-law, however, remained completely unaware of any of this. She continued to move through the party as if she had full control over everything connected to her family and business influence. In her mind, she had already dealt with her daughter-in-law and made her point clear in front of everyone important. But what she did not know was that the person she had just humiliated was not someone who needed approval from the environment she was trying to dominate. She had quietly stepped into a system where authority was not visible on the surface. And now, that system had begun to respond. Back outside the hall, the daughter-in-law stood for a moment longer, looking at the lights shining through the tall glass doors. She could still hear faint laughter from inside, still feel the weight of what had happened, but her expression remained unchanged. She adjusted her dress slightly, not in frustration, but in preparation. Then she slowly walked away from the entrance area, disappearing into the quieter part of the building. No one followed her. No one stopped her. But the situation she had just left behind was no longer the same as it was before she arrived. Inside the hall, the celebration continued, but the atmosphere had changed in a way most people could not clearly explain. The music was still playing, glasses were still being filled, and polite laughter still moved from group to group. Yet something invisible had shifted beneath all of it. People who had witnessed the earlier incident were no longer fully relaxed. They kept glancing around, lowering their voices, and avoiding direct comments. Some tried to laugh it off as a family misunderstanding, but even they could feel that it was not something small anymore. There was a strange pressure in the air, like the moment before a storm that no one is willing to name. The mother-in-law remained in the center of attention for a while. She was speaking confidently, enjoying the presence of important guests, and acting as if nothing had happened. In her mind, the situation had already been handled. She believed she had established control in front of everyone who mattered. But control built on pride often ignores the quiet signs of change. A few tables away, one of the senior company managers received a message on his phone. His expression changed slightly as he read it. He did not react loudly, but he slowly put his glass down and excused himself from the group. No explanation, no dramatic exit, just a quiet step away. At another corner of the hall, a staff member who usually handled event coordination checked a tablet device. A notification had appeared that required immediate attention. His face tightened for a moment. He whispered something to another colleague, and both of them moved toward the side of the hall. It was subtle, almost invisible to the guests who were focused on food, music, and conversation. But for those who worked closely within the company's structure, it was enough to understand that something had started shifting behind the surface. The mother-in-law did not notice these changes at first. She was still caught in the feeling of control, still replaying the earlier moment in her mind where she had thrown the wine. To her, it had been a clear message of authority, a reminder of hierarchy. She believed everyone had understood it. What she did not realize was that not everyone in that room measured authority in the same way. Far away from the hall, in a quiet office space on another floor of the same building complex, internal systems were being reviewed. Screens displayed company data, approval logs, and financial flow updates. A few senior figures were seated around a long table, speaking in low voices. They were not reacting emotionally. There was no anger, no gossip, just careful observation and quiet decisions being made step by step. A document had been placed on the table earlier that evening. It contained instructions that carried significant weight within the organization. The instructions were not loud or dramatic. They were precise, structured, and legally grounded. One of the executives leaned forward and asked a simple question. "Are we fully confirming this direction?" Another person nodded. "It comes from the highest authorization channel. There is no ambiguity." That was enough. Back at the celebration, the effects of those decisions had not yet fully reached the guests, but the early signals were already visible in small ways. A few staff members stopped responding immediately to requests. Certain services that were usually quick began to slow down slightly. Not enough for most guests to complain, but enough for careful observers to notice. The mother-in-law finally sensed that something was different. She turned to a staff member and gave a simple instruction, expecting the usual immediate response. But the staff member hesitated for a brief moment before replying. That hesitation was new. It had never happened before. She frowned slightly. "Did you hear me?" she asked again, sharper this time. The staff member nodded quickly and left, but the reaction was not as smooth as before. There was a delay, a pause, a sense of uncertainty. She did not like it. She turned toward another person she recognized from company operations and called them over. "What is going on? Why is everything slower than usual?" The person looked slightly uncomfortable. "There are some internal updates happening," they said carefully. "We are just following new instructions." "New instructions from who?" she asked immediately. There was a brief silence before the answer came, but it was vague. "From higher management." That answer should have been simple, but something about the tone made it unclear. Higher management could mean many things in a large company. She narrowed her eyes, but before she could press further, another guest approached her, pulling her back into conversation. Still, the feeling stayed with her. Meanwhile, outside the hall, the daughter-in-law was not present, but her influence was slowly becoming more visible within the structure she had long remained quiet about. She was not issuing emotional commands or reacting to personal insult. Instead, she was allowing the system to function as it was designed to function, without interference from personal bias or informal power plays. Inside that structure, her position was not based on appearance, family connection, or social standing. It was based on documented authority, long-term involvement, and decisions made far before this night ever took place. That was the part most people around her never understood. They saw her silence and assumed absence of power. They saw her calmness and assumed lack of importance. But in reality, her silence was often where the most important decisions were made. Back inside the hall, the celebration was now moving toward its later stages. Some guests were preparing to leave. Others were still enjoying conversations near the tables. But the earlier energy of confidence had softened. The mother-in-law noticed that a few people she usually interact with were no longer giving her full attention. One executive she respected had left without saying goodbye. Another had become unusually formal in conversation. She began to feel a subtle discomfort, though she could not identify its source clearly. She approached a senior board member who was still present and asked directly, "Is there something happening in the company that I am not aware of?" The board member paused for a moment. His expression was controlled, careful. "There are always internal adjustments in a large organization," he said. "That is not what I asked," she replied more firmly. He looked at her briefly, then spoke in a lower tone. "Some decisions are not part of public discussion." That sentence made her pause. She was used to being included in conversations that mattered, used to being informed, consulted, and acknowledged. This level of distance felt unfamiliar. She tried to push further, but the board member politely excused himself and moved away. Again, not rude, not dramatic, just distant. That was when she finally started to feel something she had not expected that night: uncertainty. At the same time, somewhere in the internal structure of the company, final confirmations were being processed. A few approvals were being updated. Certain permissions were being reassigned, not in a chaotic way, but in a controlled and structured manner. It was not punishment. It was adjustment, a correction within a system that had rules deeper than personal relationships or emotional reactions. Back in the hall, the music was now softer, signaling the end of the event. Guests were slowly leaving. Conversations were fading. The celebration that once felt loud and powerful was now becoming quiet and scattered. The mother-in-law stood near one of the tables, holding her phone, tried to reach someone she usually relied on for clarity. But responses were slow, delayed, or unclear. For the first time that night, her confident expression did not feel as steady as before. And somewhere beyond the walls of the hall, a structure she had never fully understood was quietly continuing its work, step by step, without emotion without noise, and without needing permission from anyone who had mistaken silence for weakness. The night had almost ended, and the celebration hall was slowly losing its energy. Guests who had arrived in elegant dresses and expensive suits were now preparing to leave. Some were still talking in small groups near the exit, while others had already stepped outside into the cool night air. The music had softened into something slow and distant. The lights still looked beautiful, but they no longer felt festive. Instead, they looked like they were marking the end of something important. The mother-in-law stood near one of the main tables, holding her phone tightly. Her confidence from earlier in the evening had started to fade, even though she was trying hard not to show it. She kept her posture straight, her expression controlled, but her eyes kept moving around the room. Something was wrong. She could feel it, even if she could not clearly understand it. People were not behaving the same way anymore. A few important guests had left without proper goodbye. Some staff members avoided eye contact. A few conversations stopped suddenly when she approached. It was not obvious enough for others to openly question, but it was clear enough for her to notice. She tried calling one of the senior company contacts again. The phone rang, but no one answered immediately. After a long delay, a short message came through. "Busy. Will respond later." That was unusual. She frowned and tried another contact. The same pattern repeated. Delayed responses. Short replies. No clear explanations. For someone who was used to quick attention and immediate respect within the company's circle, this silence felt uncomfortable. At the same time, across the city, in a quiet, secured office environment, several senior members of the organization were still working. There was no celebration there, no music, no noise. Only screens, documents, and quiet discussions. A final set of instructions had been reviewed and confirmed earlier. Now, those instructions were being carried out step by step, not in a dramatic way, but in a structured and professional manner. One of the senior executives leaned back in his chair and spoke calmly. "Everything is aligning as expected." Another nodded. "There will be short-term confusion, but it will stabilize quickly." There was no emotion in their tone. No anger, no excitement. Only responsibility. Back at the hall, the daughter-in-law was no longer present in person, but her presence was still felt in the way things had started to shift. She had not raised her voice. She had not created a scene. She had not tried to argue or defend herself after the earlier humiliation. Instead, she had allowed systems to respond in their own way. And systems, unlike people, do not act out of pride or anger. They act based on structure, rules, and authority that has already been defined long before emotions enter the picture. Inside the hall, the mother-in-law finally stepped away from the main crowd and walked toward a quieter corner near the side exit. For the first time that night, her face no longer carried full confidence. It carried confusion. She replayed the earlier moment in her mind. The wine glass, the silence of the guests, the calm expression of the woman she had humiliated. At that time, she had believed it was a victory, a clear demonstration of control. Now it felt different. Now it felt like something had started from that moment, something she did not fully understand. She turned slightly when she noticed a familiar board member approaching. She quickly stepped forward, expecting answers. "You need to tell me what is happening," she said directly. "Why are people acting strange? Why are my calls being ignored?" The board member looked at her calmly. His expression was polite but distant. "There are internal decisions being implemented," he said. "That is not an answer," she replied firmly. "I am part of this family structure. I have the right to know what is going on." There was a pause. Then he spoke in a careful tone. "Some parts of the organization operate beyond informal involvement." Her expression tightened slightly. "Informal involvement?" He nodded slowly. "Yes." She did not like the sound of that. Before she could ask more, another staff member approached the board member and whispered something. The board member nodded and excused himself. Just like that, the conversation ended. No confrontation, no explanation, only distance. She stood there for a moment, trying to understand what was happening, but the answers were not coming from anyone around her anymore. Meanwhile, outside the hall, the daughter-in-law had returned to a quiet location nearby. She was no longer thinking about the party or the humiliation. Those moments had already passed. What mattered now was what had been set in motion. She sat in a calm space, reviewing a few details on her device. Her expression remained steady, not emotional, not reactive, but focused. There was no satisfaction in revenge. There was no anger driving her decisions, only clarity. She had never needed to prove her importance loudly, and she still did not. Back at the hall, the final guests were leaving. The celebration was ending completely now. Chairs were being adjusted, tables were being cleared, and the staff were beginning cleanup procedures. The mother-in-law remained standing near the exit area, still, trying to piece together what had changed. She spoke to one more senior person, her voice lower now, less confident. "I want a clear explanation," she said. "I deserve to know where I stand." The person she spoke to hesitated for a moment, then replied carefully, "Your position within the family is not in question." That statement should have been reassuring, but it was followed by a pause. "And within the company's structure?" she asked quickly. The answer came after a moment of silence. "Company structure follows documented authority." That sentence stayed in the air longer than expected. She stared at them. Documented authority, what does that mean exactly? But instead of answering, the person gave a small polite nod and walked away. That was it. No further explanation. No discussion. Just quiet exits and closed conversations. For the first time, she felt something unfamiliar rising inside her. Not anger this time, but uncertainty mixed with something deeper. A realization that she might not fully understand the system she believed she had influence over. Outside, the night air was cooler now. The celebration hall lights were dimming as operations wound down. Cars were leaving one by one from the entrance. The event that had started with luxury and pride was now ending in silence. The mother-in-law finally stepped outside. She paused near the entrance, looking back at the hall for a moment. Everything looked normal from the outside. Beautiful, even peaceful. But it did not feel the same anymore. She checked her phone again. Still no clear responses. Only delays and short messages. Behind her, the building lights reflected softly on the polished ground. The night was quiet. And somewhere in the same system she had always believed she understood, decisions were already being finalized, not as punishment, not as reaction, but as correction. She did not know it yet, but the balance she had taken for granted was no longer the same. And the woman she had tried to humiliate earlier that evening was not standing in silence because she was powerless. She was standing in silence because she had never needed noise to be heard.